Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery, and today we have the great Bobby Fischer going up against Tigran Petrosian. This game was played in 1958, and this is a very significant game in Fischer's history. He's not playing just a good player or a great player, he's playing a legendary player, one who would later himself become world champion. This is game number 4 in Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games. Tigran Petrosian has the white pieces. Bobby Fischer has the black pieces. Let's dive right in. Petrosian begins with c4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, knight f3, and d6, castles, knight c6. And here Petrosian has a choice. He can play the pawn to d3 or d4, and he chooses to play the pawn to d3, not d4. He keeps the English structure. This gives black fewer targets in the king's Indian to attack, but it also is a little bit less aggressive on white's part. It's sort of slower opening. Fischer plays knight to h5 to clear the way for the f-pawn. He's ready to attack the king, and here Petrosian makes a unique and somewhat strange decision, but an insightful one. He plays d4. He says, well, I'm losing a tempo, but now that the knight is on h5, this is a better structure for me. So he plays d4. Fischer attacks the center. Petrosian gains space, knight e7, e4, and f5, the traditional break on the king side. Fischer thought that c5 was better, but modern games and computers show us that after pawn takes, en passant takes, rook e1, that white's actually a bit better in this position. So he breaks with f5, ef5, gf5, and now knight takes e5. So he takes the pawn at e5, but he unveils the queen's attack on the knight at h5, and he plays knight to g3, sort of an intermediate move designed to regain that pawn that he's lost, hg3, and then he decides to take with the bishop. Later, Fischer would say taking with the d-pawn and leaving those two pawns together to attack would have been the better choice, but Fischer in the game goes ahead and takes with the bishop. Petrosian responds with f4, kicking the bishop back to g7, bishop to e3. He wants to eliminate that dark squared bishop that's very strong at g7 by playing his own bishop to d4 and challenging it. Bishop to d7, bishop to d4. Knight to g6, with the plan of advancing the h-pawn and weakening this pawn on f4 for white. Rook to e1. Perhaps a better move would have been bishop to f3 to control the h5 square so the pawn can't advance. He plays rook to e1 instead. And here Fischer plays bishop to f7. He thought he himself should have just taken the bishop, and after queen takes, go ahead and play h5. Now, since Petrosian didn't play bishop f3. But instead he plays rook f7. Bishop f3 now controls the square. Queen f8 clears the way for the rook. King f2, rook e8. Takes, bishop takes, rook takes. It would be a blunder to take with the king because of queen d4 check. Attacking the king and the a-pawn, the king moves, queen takes a7, and Petrosian would begin to eat those queenside pawns. So he takes with the rook, queen to d4, b6 to defend the a7 pawn, rook to h1, putting the rook on the h-file, putting pressure against the king. But it turns out probably a better move was b4 to go ahead and gain that queenside space right now. And Fischer responds to rook h1 with the move a5, controlling b4 himself. So now b4 cannot be played. Knight to d1, rerouting the knight to e3 to hit that pawn at f5. Queen to f8, knight to e3 hits the pawn. Rook to f7 defends the pawn, over-defends it. And it also clears the way for the queen to come to g7 and trade herself off. b3, queen to g7. Now, trading queens helps Bobby Fischer with the black pieces because Petrosian has a lot of space. So by getting queens off the board, it makes it a little bit easier for Fischer to maneuver his pieces. Queen g7 check, king g7, a3, and Petrosian's queenside pawns begin to move to gain space. Rook to f8, bishop to e2, rerouting that bishop to d3 so he can put more pressure on the f5 pawn. Knight to e7 defends the pawn, bishop to d3, h6, which just sort of gets the pawn off of a light square. Then rook to h5. Notice how Petrosian is zeroing in on Fischer's primary weakness and using all of his forces, all of his pieces are all attacking the pawn at f5. The bishop goes to e8, hits the rook. The rook retreats to h2. The bishop goes back to d7, rook to h1, rook to h8. Fischer can sort of in a holding pattern here. He's got to be on defense for a while. The knight goes to c2, rerouting itself to d4. And in my 60 memorable games, Fischer takes this moment to comment on how impressed he is with the way Petrosian always seems to find a way to improve his pieces. All the time, he keeps finding better squares, better places for his pieces to go. Now the knight aims for d4. King to f6, knight d4, king g7. Fischer's just waiting. Bishop to e2, knight to g8. Fischer felt the knight should have stayed where it was, and instead rook to a8, just in case the a file were to open. But he plays knight to g8, b4, he breaks open, knight f6, aiming at e4 or g4, bishop to d3 again to keep the knight from e4, ab4, king g6 to defend that h5 square, rook to a1, and now Petrosian has control of the open A file, the only open file that has actual penetration points on it where the rook can actually get in. The E file is open, but you can't get in there. Knight to g4 check, king to e2, rook to e8 check, king to d2, king f6, knight to f6, rook to a6 first. This doesn't really change much. I guess it creates an X-ray pressure against the king at g6. Fischer plays rook to b8, but then after rook a7, rook c8, you get the same position you would have had if Petrosian had just played rook to a7 in the first place. c5, breaking on the queen side, and it's a temporary pawn sacrifice to get control of the e5 square. So pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now knight f3. The knight reroutes to the now unprotected and supported support point at e5. That's a strong square for the knight. King goes to f7, knight to e5 check, king to e7, knight takes bishop, but he wins material as he gets rid of the nice knight, but he's going to win that f5 pawn. The material is actually equal, but black has broken pawns. All three pawns from black are weak, and with pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop is a better minor piece than the knight is. The rook goes to f8 and g4. Now, bishop takes d7, Fischer felt would have been a draw for black. Oh, well, for both sides, a draw. Because, rook endgames in general are a little more drawish, but a variation he gave is king d7, king e3, king d6, check, king d5, rook captures h6, and rook e8 check. After king f3, c4, Fischer felt that this position would be a draw. Petrosian plays g4, and then Fischer plays king to d6. He thought he should have played knight to f6 here. After bishop e6, knight takes d5, giving up a piece, but after bishop takes d5, rook takes f4, and this position would be a draw because the g4 pawn can't be defended, and this would be a drawn position. So king to d6, bishop d7, king d7, king to e3. So now this is a bit better rook ending for Petrosian than the one we've just seen. And it's very, very subtle. Little things that are one move, one way or the other, are the difference between winning and losing this position. Fischer begins with rook to e8 check. Petrosian moves the king, king d6. Now rook to a6 check, king d5, and rook takes h6. So now we have kind of a race between Petrosian's f and g pawns and Fischer's doubled c pawns. So Fischer begins by advancing his passed pawn to c4. Now here Petrosian makes a move that he felt was a mistake. He plays the move rook to h1, which, getting the rook behind his own pawns and controlling this queening square for black does make sense. But he felt the winning line, and I'll just give you one line, one variation, was rook to h7, hitting the c pawn. Obviously, you can't let him take that pawn. c6, and now rook to d7 check, king c5, now rook to d1, c3, and then g5, and this is the race. King c4, pawns advance, and what he's going to do is sacrifice his rook for the c pawn at the right time and then use his two pawns to win in this variation. So king c3, f5, rook g8, king f4, king d2. Now rook takes c2 check, king takes c2, and king to g5. So he's down a rook in the variation, but his pawns would be too strong. After c5, f6, c4, f7, rook g6, king g6, c3, and queen. And this is a win for white. So that was a variation Petrosian thought he should have played instead of this rook to h1 move. So basically we get the same thing, but he's down a tempo now. c3, g5, c5, rook d1, king c4, g6, c2, rook c1, king d3, f5, rook to g8, king f4, king to d2, rook to c2 check, king c2. So it's the same as the other variation, except now this pawn is one square up. And that makes all the difference between a win and a draw. Petrosian plays king to g5, c4, f6, c3, f7. And now, because he has that one tempo, Fischer plays rook takes g6 check, king g6, king b1, queen, and c2. And this is a draw, and they agreed to a draw. This is a textbook draw. Now, it may not look like a draw if you're unfamiliar with this endgame, but if the side with the pawn has that pawn on a rook file or a bishop file on the 7th rank about to queen, then in many circumstances, even though you're down a queen, it's a draw. And I'll just give you a quick variation to show why this is actually a draw and not a win for white, even though he's up a queen. Queen to b4 check, king to a1, queen to c3 check, king to b1, queen to b3. So normally the idea in an endgame like this is that black has to move here to keep his pawn defended, and then the stronger side moves their king forward. And then you just repeat until the stronger side's king is right next to the pawn, and then you win. The problem is there's a little trick black has in this position that they can play the king to a1. And now the pawn is threatening the queen, and the stronger side can't take the pawn because queen takes c2 is a stalemate. And of course, both of these players would have known this endgame backwards and forwards, so they agreed to a draw in this position. I hope you enjoyed this game against two titans of chess, Fischer's memorable game number 4. Thank you for joining us at Chess Talk. See you again soon.